All right, let's get started. Good morning, everybody. This is our second class on in the boot camp, Christian boot camp. This week is the reliability of the Gospels. Two books I would encourage if anyone wants to read any further. The Historical Reliability of the Gospels by Craig Bloomberg, which is really, really cool. So if you're interested in that, this is one of my favorites by Richard Bachman, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, the Gospels as Eyewitness Testimony. These are really, both of them are relatively new. This one came out in 2007. I say new because in biblical scholarship, that's pretty new. And then this was 2006. So there's a lot of really cool stuff that's coming out in regards to the actual earlier dating of the Gospels and the historicity of the Gospels account. So let's dive right in and start, because as you can see in your packets, I basically have given you a doctoral dissertation that we have to cover in 40 minutes. All right, so let's roll through. I'm going to start out by a quote by the guy I like to beat up on a lot, Bart Ehrman. Anyone know who Bart Ehrman is? Good. Bart Ehrman is an atheist, but he is the head New Testament scholar at Chapel Hill in the University of North Carolina. That's like having me be your weight loss instructor. So he's it's kind of interesting. If we ever get hit in a situation where you run out of toilet paper because of a pandemic, start with his books. They're useful for that. And the only reason I like to beat up on him is because his scholarship is just awful. It's really bad scholarship, but its mentality has seeped into a lot of what we think is being said about the scriptures in the New Testament, and it's really based on just bad all-around stuff. So I'm going to unpack his paragraph from Jesus, Apocalyptic Prophet of a New Millennium. Over these next couple minutes here, we talk about this. The New Testament Gospels were written 35 to 65 years after Jesus' death, and not by people who were eyewitnesses, but by people living later. And where did these people get their information from? After the days of Jesus, people started telling stories about him in order to convert others to the faith. When Christians recognized the need for apostolic authorities, they attributed these books to apostles, Matthew and John, and close companions of apostles, Mark, the secretary of Peter, and Luke, the traveling companion of Paul. Because our surviving Greek manuscripts provide such a wide variety of different titles for the Gospels, textual scholars have long realized that their familiar names, the Gospel according to Matthew, do not go back to a single original title, but were later added by scribes. Okay? That has kind of been what most of people actually think of the dating of the New Testament and how the New Testament Gospels are written. Most of which, the things that he said there are not actually factually true, but it comes across great because it's in a book. Let's talk manuscripts just for fun, all right? So if we're going to start from the premise of who wrote the Gospels, when were they dated, right? First of all, we got to look at the evidence of actual manuscripts, which is kind of fascinating. You know, when people when people try to disprove the dating of the New Testament, most of it is not based on any archaeological evidence. It's based on a theology or a philosophy. We're going to get to some of that. A theology or a philosophy. Most are trying to disprove it because they want to say that Jesus didn't exist. Because let's face reality, when you're confronted with something like the resurrection, you either got to say it's true or it's not. And to say it's not is by making sure the evidence that actually says it's true is fictitious. It's fictitious, right? When you look at the manuscripts, though, for things that we already know, for example, Homer's Iliad, which we all read, well, I hope we all read, right? It was written probably around 800 years before the birth of Christ. The earliest copy or manuscript we have comes 400 years later, in 400, so there's a 400 time gap. The number of copies or manuscripts we have is 643. But let's look at the life of Caesar. No one denies the life of Julius Caesar in the Gallic Wars, which probably happened sometime between 100 to 44 years before the birth of Christ. The earliest copy we have of that goes back to 900 years. It's a 1,000-year gap between when those events occurred with Julius Caesar and actually when we have the earliest manuscripts. Oh, and by the way, we only have 10 of those. But look at the New Testament. We have 5,366 Greek manuscripts, which was probably the language. Look, Joe's nodding. He's like, yes. Well, Joe is nodding because it's the Greek. That's actually the written language of the New Testament. But we actually have other languages like Coptic and Syrian and some other documents of manuscripts that go back just as early as they did, to the tune of 24,000. We have more manuscripts of the New Testament than most, if not all, of our ancient history. So to say that they were pieced together by a couple manuscripts is not actually what the actual biblical archaeological evidence actually is. All right? So I just want to start with that point. Go back to page 2. People are constantly finding new manuscripts. They're sometimes hidden in monasteries, or sometimes hidden in the Vatican libraries. They're all over the place. The earliest fragment of a gospel that we have, or piece of the New Testament that we have, is Papyrus 90, which is a fragment of the Gospel of John, chapter 18, verses 36, and then chapter 19. And it actually carbon dates from anywhere from 110 to 112, which is pretty awesome. Yeah, it's at I forget which university it's actually on display at. Yeah. Sitting right there. But look when it's carbon dated. Talking 70 years, right? By the way, when things are actually written down, it's normally been actually promoted for a longer time than that. All right, it's a copy. The earliest gospel manuscripts in which titles have survived seem to have been copied in the late 2nd to 3rd centuries. And I've listed the papyrus. What do I mean there? That's where it actually says the gospel according to blank or according to blank. Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, whatever. That's the title. How were ancient documents titled? And this is kind of fascinating. Yes, some were at tops of pages, like we kind of do today. Like this one here says, the Christian Boot Camp Reboot, right? Doesn't have my name on it, by the way. But sometimes they were titled at the top of the sheets. But most had little things at the end or the beginning of the manuscript known as silly boy. Probably where we get the word syllabus from. I gave you a little illustration of what those look like. It was a tag on a document. This one here comes from the 1st or 2nd century. It's a copy of Sophron's Mimes on Women, but it actually gives the author of who actually wrote it, right? Those were attached to some of the documents. Those actually easily can be taken off a document or lost, right? Of the thousands of manuscripts, so if Bart Ehrman's copy there was about we have a variety of titles. Of the thousands of manuscripts which we have titles for that are actually on documents, they are always ascribed, and the same texts are always ascribed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. I love this quote from Brant Petrie. The first and perhaps biggest problem for the theory of anonymous gospels is this. No anonymous copies of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John have ever been found. They do not exist. As far as we know, they never have. That's kind of fascinating, right? So what does he mean by a wide variety of gospel titles? There are actually no variations in which authors are ascribed to which gospels. For example, the Codex Washingtonianus, which is probably who it was found by, titled The Gospel According to Matthew, while the title of the same gospel in Codex Sinaiticus is According to Matthew. It's not according to Jehoshaphat, or according to Alexander, or according to Bishop Jason. That's not in there, right? It's clearly attributed to Matthew. I don't understand the word codex. Codex are manuscripts or actual books, okay? The Codex Alexandrinus, Gospel according to Mark. The Codex Vaticanus is attributed to the title according to Mark. Throughout the titled manuscripts, the literary forms of the titles may shift according to or gospel according to, but the same author is attributed to the same gospel in every titled manuscript. All right? So this understanding that there were anonymous gospels and people just plugged titles in centuries later doesn't match the manuscript evidence. And even in the case where we have titles, the same text, for example, the Samaritan woman story we're going to read in the gospel today, has always been attributed to John, not Matthew, Mark, or Luke. And it's always been given that title. And even when he says wide variety of titles, that's actually misinformation. Because the wide variety is literally either the gospel according to or according to. not a change in author. All right?
Are these titles on the scrolls as well as...
So as I mentioned, they were normally done three ways. Either there's a tag at the top of the title, or there's actually a small tag, as I just showed you as an evidence, that were attached to documents. Those tags, unfortunately, are easily destroyed or removed or pulled off. Like if you have tabs in books now, they're easily coming off, which is why maybe some of the early manuscripts that we have don't have them because they were tagged that way for the first or second century.
They were in scrolls before they were put into books.
Oh, yes. Or some are fragments and pieces.
So the same title could be...
Yes. All right, so let's check out who are these people, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, who are actually listed in these scriptures. Matthew was a tax collector. By the way, tax collectors were one of the literate careers. They could read and write for purposes of legal receipts, legal contracts, licenses, personal letters. It would make sense if Matthew actually wrote a gospel because he was probably one of the most literate of the apostles. Who was Mark? Mark is a companion not only of St. Paul, but most importantly, Mark was a disciple of St. Peter. He was very well known in the first century, and this is actually from the letter of Peter. By Silvanus, a faithful brother, as I regard him, I have written briefly to you, exhorting and declaring that this is the true grace of God. Stand fast in it. She who is at Babylon, by the way, the word for Babylon in New Testament really is Rome. She who is at Rome, who is likewise chosen, the church in Rome, sends you greetings, and so does my son Mark. Paul refers to his disciples as sons. They call him father. That's why we call priest father or mother, by the way. It goes back to that kind of discipleship stuff. So Mark mostly is a disciple of St. Peter. What do we know about Luke? He was a doctor. He's a historian. He was a companion to Paul. This is from his own gospel. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things which have been accomplished among us, just as they were delivered to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write carefully in order for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the facts concerning the things of which you have been informed. And then last but not least, John, who we know is also a disciple. He was referred to in his gospel as disciple whom Jesus loved. You see that kind of there in John 21. So that's kind of internal evidence. What do we have from external evidence of who these people were? This is the stuff I really love. These are early church witnesses. This is what the early church knew of these evangelists, right? This is from Papyrus. He's writing in 130. Mark, having become Peter's translator, wrote down accurately whatever he remembered. It was not, however, in exact order that he related the sayings or deeds of Christ, for he neither heard the Lord nor accompanied him. He accompanied Peter, who accommodated his instructions to the necessities of his hearers, but with no intention of giving an ordered narrative of the Lord's sayings. Therefore, Mark made no mistake in writing things as he remembered them. Of one thing he took special care, not to omit anything he had heard, and not to put anything fictitious into the statements. Matthew put together sayings in the Hebrew language, and each one translated them as best as he could. So what's fascinating about Papyrus? He's writing in 130, which means the Gospel of Mark had to be written way before that, by the way, right? But he's also saying how Mark is actually doing. Now, it's interesting that he talks about Mark not putting the sayings down in order, but to accommodate the necessities of his hearers. A lot think the reason why Mark's gospel is short is because being in Rome with Peter, he was probably writing it for those who were preparing for baptism. It was like a small version of the gospel to get all the good stuff that you need to get so he can get you dunked, right? Which possibly why it was shorter, which is why, interestingly enough, Papyrus may say stuff like, doing it for the intention of the hearers. It was written for people who were going to be baptized. Okay? The Muratorian Fragment. That sounds like a great movie, right? So this is a document. We actually don't know who wrote this one, but it was actually a fragment. But it goes to 170. It's literally the clearest list of the New Testament we have so early on, 170. First portion of it hasn't survived, but it starts out with, at which he was present, so he included them. It's probably talking about Matthew, by the way. The third book of the gospel is according to Luke. Luke, the well-known physician, after the ascension of Christ, when Paul had taken with him as one zealous for the law, composed it in his own name, according to widespread belief. Yet he himself had not seen the Lord in the flesh, and therefore he was able to ascertain events. So indeed he begins to tell the story from the birth of John. The fourth of the Gospels is that of John, one of the disciples. To his fellow disciples and overseers who have been urging him to write, he said, "Fast with me from today until the third day, and what will be revealed to each one of us, let us tell one another." In the same night, it was revealed to Andrew, one of the apostles, that John should write down all things in his own name, while all of them should review it. And so, through various elements may be taught in the individual books of the Gospels. Nevertheless, this makes no difference to the faith of believers, since by the one sovereign Spirit all things have been declared in all of them concerning the birth, the death, the resurrection, his life with his disciples, and his twofold coming. First in lowliness when he was despised, which has taken place. The second glorious in royal power, which is still to come. Irenaeus. I love Irenaeus. Irenaeus was a disciple of Polycarp. Polycarp was a disciple of John the Evangelist, John the Apostle. He's writing in 190. There are 4 Gospels and only 4, neither more nor less. Christ is at the center of them. John actually speaks of his kingly and glorious sonship to the Father in his own words, "In the beginning was the Word." Luke begins with the Zechariah offering a sacrifice. Matthew chooses first of all the Lord's human genealogy, and Mark leads off by calling on the prophetic spirit which invests humanity from on high. Matthew issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own language, while Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome. That's interesting. While Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome, we're going to get back to that, in laying the foundations of the church. After their departure, Mark, Peter's follower and translator, handed down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter. Luke, also the companion of Paul, recorded in a book the gospel preached by him. And afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord, who also had leaned on his chest, published a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia. And the last one, and then we'll unpack all this. Clement of Alexandria, writing in 200. Of all those who had been with the Lord, only Matthew and John left us their recollections, and tradition says that they took to writing perforce. John, it is said, used all the time a message which was not written down, and at last took to writing for the following cause. The 3 Gospels which had been written down before were distributed to all, including himself. It is said he welcomed them and testified to their truth, but said that there was only lacking to the narrative the account of what was done by Christ at first and at the beginning of the preaching. They say accordingly that John was asked to relate in his own gospel the period passed over in silence by the former evangelists. So why do I quote these people? Bart Ehrman says were anonymous gospels. Only after the 2nd or 3rd century or even later, it gets attributed because they had to give these documents some form of authoritative voice by having 2 as apostles and 2 as other people who were close to the apostles. Number one, if you wanted to give an authoritative voice, you would have made them all 4 apostles. That would have been the first thing. But number 2, the external evidence from the early church doesn't say that. It's very clear from the early church that they believed that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John actually wrote these texts, and giving some various interesting details, like Mark was actually taking it down from Peter, right? And I love what Clement of Alexandria says about John, that John literally had all the other 3 Gospels and was just filling in the missing parts, which is interesting. The wedding feast of Cana, the Samaritan story that we're going to hear today, is only found in John, not the other Gospels. But it's interesting that even Clement is saying that the Gospels were already out before John was writing. We're going to start talking about some early dates, okay? All right, so those are who the evangelists are. How can we date them? Or what is the date? Now, the Gospels, fragments that we all have, don't say, I'm writing this in blank, like we have on our computers in the documents, right? None of that existed, right? They don't say when they actually were composed. This is why behind all of that is not only textual evidence, but there's theology and philosophy behind that. A majority of New Testament scholars say this is when the Gospels were composed. Mark sometime between 60 and 75. Matthew between 65 and 85. Luke 65 to 95. John sometime where 175 to 100. All right? That's kind of the majority. We're going to go into some other dating issues. But the reason why people want to see when the date was is to try to disprove it or to try to prove the manuscripts, right? If you're writing something hundreds of years after the fact, and I've actually gotten into arguments with people, oh, the Gospels were written 100 years after the death of Christ. Wrong. But why do they say that? Because if 100 years go past, then all of it was probably just fictitiously made up. We're going to write this story of the resurrection. We're going to write the story about the birth. The farther away you get, and historical people who were actually present are dead, then you can make up some fantasies, right? George Washington never told a lie and chopped down a cherry tree, right? That didn't happen, according to the actual stuff, according to the sources. But you're several years and decades after the life of Washington before that actually comes out. Most scholars will say you need 3 generations before something becomes a myth. 3 generations, you're talking about 90 years. Because people who are historically alive or people who were historically alive who actually knew the other person would say no, right? For example, the resurrection. It'd be very easy to say, I don't know why I'm reading all this stuff about Jesus popping out of the tomb. Let me show you his dead body because I put him here as a Roman soldier, right? The historical people will be able to do that. So it takes a while. But if you notice, even in the Gospels at later dates, even John at the furthest end, that John is writing his Gospel in the year 100, is only 70 years after the events. It's still within that time frame. If you notice, the documentation that we have that we all don't question, the life of Caesar, the life of Homer, and all this other stuff, is written hundreds of years after that, sometimes thousands. But the Gospels are written extremely close to the historical events themselves, which gives more credence to they are actually authentically true what they are saying. All right? I think the Gospels are actually done earlier. Let's start looking at outside evidence first, really quickly. I can't believe I got to do this in 20 minutes. Gear up. All right. Outside the manuscripts, we have other evidence. The Didache, which was the teaching of the 12, which is around 95, quotes Matthew's version of the Lord's Prayer almost verbatim. Clement of Rome, I love Clement of Rome. He dates early as well because he even mentions the temple still standing. We're going to get to what that means. As you can see, he quotes Matthew and the other Gospels. If they are quoting verbatim, that means the texts are already there. They're already there. These two are already quoting it in 95, not hundreds of years, 20 years, 25 years, right? 50 years. The Epistle of Barnabas, which is recorded around 100, quotes Matthew. The language is identical to the Greek. Ignatius, in 100, cites the Gospel of Matthew several times. By the way, those are his letters to the Ephesians and the Smyrnians and to Polycarp. He also quotes John chapter 3, which means John had to be written before then if he's quoting it. Polycarp, he's earlier, right? Actually, Polycarp. He cites Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Tatian created his harmonization of the 4 Gospels, which shows that the Gospels were known and used to the point that Syriac Christians were writing harmonies of them by 173. This is all very, very early. So Bart Ehrman's bizarre quote that this was done centuries later doesn't hold up to the evidence. Let's talk about the book of Acts. Those 2 books that I just read to you, and if you guys were not here, I encourage you to grab these. These are great, great books. The Historical Reliability of the Gospels by Craig Bloomberg, as well as Richard Bachman's Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. These are really 2 extraordinary books. A lot of modern scholarship is coming out, which is dating the book of Acts earlier than we actually think, for several reasons. A lot date it possibly to 62. Now put that into context. If it's at 62, that means Luke's gospel has to be written before that because the book of Acts is part 2, right? It's not like J.K. Rowling where you write the last part first and then you write the first part. He did the first book, his gospel first, and then the Acts of the Apostles. A lot of modern scholars are starting to possibly date this earlier. Why? There's some internal evidence. Number 1, and this is where everything hinges, the fall of Jerusalem. The fall of Jerusalem happened by 70 AD. We're talking 40 years. What do I mean, the fall of Jerusalem? Rome was so tired of Jewish revolting by this time, they came in and they basically leveled the city. They tore down the temple. Not one stone of the temple of Solomon and the later editions of Herod was left standing. They were crucifying hundreds and hundreds of people on the walls of Jerusalem. It was the most cataclysmic event that the early world, especially in Jerusalem, ever knew. All right? It would have been earth-shattering, like the beginning of World War II, or even in our day, September the 11th. That's how earth-shattering the fall of Jerusalem would have been, which happened, we know, in 70. All right? The book of Acts doesn't record it. As you see in here, the Romans completely decimated the city of Jerusalem in an absolute bloodbath. Josephus, who was a Jewish scholar and a writer, some of his stuff is whack, but for the most part he gets it, states that the Roman army killed almost 1 million Jews and took 200,000 captives as slaves. This 3-year period from 66 to 70 was an absolute nightmare. And yet it is not mentioned at all in the Gospels or in the book of Acts by Luke. Acts doesn't also record Nero's persecution of the Christians in Rome, which happens in 64, which is when Peter and Paul died. Nero began a horrific persecution of Christians after the Great Fire in Rome, crucifying Christians and burning them alive by thousands. But yet again, Luke didn't mention a word about this in his book. Luke recorded other kinds of persecutions, like in Acts 8 and Acts 11, but he didn't mention this one, which was one of the worst. Indeed, a late date for Acts, saying Acts of the Apostles was written sometime after 70, even after 80, is clearly out of character with Luke's picture of the Romans being so friendly and positive to Christianity, which would make no sense after Nero's campaign. Acts doesn't record the death of Peter or Paul or even James. Luke had no problem recording the martyrdom of Stephen, you all know in Acts 7, deacons, or James the son of Zebedee, who he does record in Acts 12, but he writes nothing about the deaths of Peter, Paul, and James. These were the 3 central leaders of the early church, but Luke doesn't even hint at their deaths. Peter was crucified by Nero in 67. Paul was beheaded by Nero in 67. James, a half-brother of Jesus. The Roman historian Josephus records the martyrdom of James, that the Sanhedrin had him stoned to death. And Christian authors add that James was thrown from the pinnacle of the temple and beaten to death with a club. Josephus regarded the death of James, but Luke didn't. Various Christian authors recorded the death of Peter and Paul, but again, Luke didn't even hint at it. Acts presents theological disputes that would only be issues before the fall of Jerusalem in 70. For example, Acts 15 centers on the question of whether Gentiles should be circumcised. But after the fall of Jerusalem in 70, most Jewish Christians were sadly gone because they all ran out. There was a mass exodus, and Gentile-centered Christianity grew exponentially. Indeed, the Gospels are very Jewish, but Judaism and Christianity departed radically after the fall of Jerusalem in 70. Acts emphasizes the legal protection of Christianity under Judaism. Before the Jewish war, Judaism was a legal religion, but after, the Romans revoked these privileges. And why then does Acts spill so much ink to demonstrate that Christianity is a legal religion like Judaism if it was written after Judaism had lost its protection in 66 because of the Jewish war? Why does Jesus heal the Roman centurion's servant? Why does Rome save Paul's life? Finally, why does Roman centurion identify Jesus as the Son of God? Because at that point, after 70, the Romans were hated. It does yield an earlier date. If Acts was written sometime in 62, that means Luke was writing probably in the late 50s, early 60s. And we're talking 25 years after the passion, death, and resurrection of Christ. That's super close. That's super close. And showing that they are historically reliable. What's the implications of the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Mark? I love this. This comes from James Rockford, who's giving evidence for the earlier dating of the Gospels. Luke states that he took much of his materials from earlier sources. We read that in Luke chapter 1. As a matter of fact, Luke copied 88% of Mark's Gospel into his own. And whenever Luke is mentioned in the New Testament, Mark is mentioned in the same context. This means that Luke and Mark probably knew each other, and that Mark's gospel predated Luke's gospel. Thus, if Luke dates to the late 50s, then how early should we date Mark? John Wenham dates Mark to the mid-40s. And even critics like James Crossley, who was the founder of the Highly Skeptical Jesus Seminar, dates Mark back to the 30s or 40s. Late 30s. When did Jesus rise from the dead? 33. Crosland, who actually is trying to only prove the historical Jesus, says Mark's gospel could have been written sometime between 38 and 39, 5 to 6 years after the actual events of the Passion, Death, and Resurrection. That puts it really close. It's like reading a newspaper at that point. Let's talk about the objection that the Gospels couldn't have been written before the fall of the temple because Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple. That's literally why scholars say the Gospels weren't written to 70, is because in the New Testament, Jesus predicted the fall of Jerusalem. Therefore, we know it was made up, and that early Christians just put those in Jesus' words because the temple fell. All right? That's what they would argue. That's what a lot of people argue. Remember, sometimes the later dating is based on a theological or philosophical thing, not an actual reality. For example, Jesus said regarding the temple, it would become desolate. Do you see all these buildings? I tell you, in truth, they will be completely demolished. Not one stone will be left on top of the other. Another prophecy of Jesus regarding Jerusalem, that the city would be set on fire, Matthew 22. Jesus forewarned his disciples, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles, Luke chapter 21. New Testament critics argue that we can't possibly date the Gospels before 70 because there was no way that Jesus could have made such predictions, but their argument doesn't hold weight. Why? As I mentioned before, this is a theological objection, not a historical one. Prophecies don't actually happen, is what they're trying to say. If Jesus can rise from the dead, then he can make a prophecy. 2, what's fascinating about that is the New Testament authors never record the fulfillment of Christ's prophecies. Luke records the fulfillment of Agabus' prediction of a famine under Emperor Claudius, Acts 11. But he never mentions Jesus' prediction about the temple. If he can relate someone who's basically a nobody, Agabus, predicting that there was going to be a famine, why wouldn't he say, oh, by the way, Jesus was right, and in 70 the temple fell? Unless it didn't happen when Luke was writing, because he's writing earlier. Christian history teaches that many Christians followed Jesus' prediction and escaped Jerusalem with their lives. For instance, Epiphanes in the 4th century wrote, the Nazarene sect exists in Beoria, Pella, and in Bashan, and that's where the sect began when all the disciples were living in Pella after they moved from Jerusalem, since Christ told them to leave Jerusalem and withdraw from it because it was about to be besieged. Likewise, he said the people of the church in Jerusalem had been commanded by a revelation vouchsafed to approve men there before the war to leave the city and dwell in a certain town called Pella. These statements fit with the idea that the Gospels existed before the Jewish war, 66 to 70, and therefore this is why the Christians in Jerusalem escaped before the war became brutal. This is the one thing I like. If the Gospels truly wrote down these predictions after the fact, then we would expect them to be much more precise. J. Robinson, who himself was a critical scholar, points that Matthew's statement about how the king set their city on fire is not good evidence for a post-70 date. After all, the city wasn't burned in 70, the temple was. Additionally, Jesus told his disciples, pray that it may not happen in the winter, Mark 13. However, it was destroyed in the summer. Jesus told his disciples to flee to the mountains, Yet, as you just heard from Eusebius and Epiphanes, they fed to Pella, which is lower than Jerusalem. So if people are trying to date it after 70 because they don't believe that Jesus' prophecies were true, it doesn't hold up to the evidence internally at all, and even externally of where the Christians actually fled to and the external documents of when these events actually happened. Which means that the Gospels were probably written before 70. That's where I fall. That's where a lot of those scholars fall. Because it doesn't mention anything, especially the Acts of the Apostles, of the major thing that happened. That's like if you were a news reporter for Time magazine in Paris in 40 when Hitler started coming in there and never mentioned Hitler. Or being in New York City on September the 11th and never mentioning the fall of the Twin Towers. That's how powerful those events were. And why is they're absent in the Gospels and the New Testament? Because they were written before it happened. That's the awesome thing. That's the awesome thing. So when do I date them? Matthew. And this is all based off of modern scholarship, by the way. This is not just me. I don't have enough time to actually start to go research all this, on my own manuscript-wise. Date of Matthew, probably 61 to 68. Matthew 22, we read the present tense to describe the Sadducees, those who say there is no resurrection. By the way, that's why they're sad, you see. They don't believe in the resurrection. Those who date Matthew after 70 will have a difficulty with this present tense form. Why? Because they disappeared after the Jewish revolt in 66 and the destruction of the temple. Irenaeus also states that Matthew writes his gospel while Peter and Paul were preaching. Remember that? This would place the writing of the gospel before the deaths of Peter and Paul, which are in 67. So sometime in the mid-60s he's writing. Once again, 25, 30 years after the passion, death, and resurrection of Christ. We already talked about Mark. Due to the evidence listed above for the dates of Acts, and that Mark was probably the first gospel. That's what we mean by Mark in priority. We could date the Gospel of Mark to the late 40s or early 50s. We kind of talked about some of that. Gospel of Luke. Again, based on the evidence for the Acts of the Apostles, we could date Luke in the mid to late 50s. In addition, several sources state that Luke wrote under Paul's supervision, some of the things we've already quoted. But since Paul died under Nero in 67, Luke has to be writing before 67. John, this is where no one knows. Some hold a date between 80 to 85. Some say that could be before 55 to 95. Ramsey Michaels dates the gospel to the second half of the first century, so 50 to 100, and he leans toward a date after 70. Some date the Gospel of John before 70, as you can see some of the work there. I'm one of the things. John always talked about the fall of the temple, and that Christ his body was the new temple. Yet he never mentions the fall of the temple at all. At all. Which means says that it was written before that. So the earlier dating of the apostles gives more credence to their historical reliability. Because if the Gospels are historically reliable and all the events that we proclaim actually happen, then you have to make a choice whether Jesus is God or a liar. Because the evidence in the Scriptures and the external evidence all points to that. Which is why New Testament scholars like Bart Ehrman, who is an atheist, are trying to destroy the historical reliability of those Gospels because he doesn't want anyone to believe that Christ is God. Because if those documents are historically reliable, then you got to make a decision. And he's probably on the wrong side of that decision. Pretty cool stuff, eh? That was a lot of heady stuff for a Sunday morning right before Mass in a 40-minute spill. I have to go before the choir kills me. But any quick questions? Whew. Yeah, and I'll leave these up here if you want to come up, take a picture with your phone and stuff. Jesus and the Eyewitness, the Gospels is Eyewitness Testimony by Richard Bachman, as well as the Historical Reliability of the Gospels by Craig Bloomberg. And there's many, many others, but these were the two I pulled off my shelf really quick. I'll leave them up here in the first pew if you want to take a look at those. Cool stuff, gang. Cool stuff. Next week, we talk about the sacrament of baptism, which will be exciting. And then the week after that, we'll talk about the liturgies of Holy Week, and then we're on break for Palm Sunday and Easter, and we'll come back afterwards. Thank you all very much. Hang out for 10 o'clock Mass if you haven't already got communion today, and we'll see you on the flip side.